and the unanswered question, who done it? The first case in our file may seem out of place in a collection of unsolved mysteries, but there are startling new clues to uncover in the tragic case of the Lindbergh kidnapping. May 21st, 1927, 10:21 p.m. He descended from the Paris night like a god. He is Charles Lindbergh, a real American hero. 2 years after his world-famous flight, the young hero marries Anne Morrow, daughter of the United States ambassador to Mexico. Soon, the Lindberghs give birth to a perfect son, Charles Augustus Jr. Like most young parents, they record his growing up with home movies. On the night of Tuesday, March the 1st, 1932, Lindbergh's perfect family life is torn apart. Around 9 p.m., someone climbs a ladder to the second floor of Anne and Charles's new home and steals their only child. Left behind, a crudely written ransom note. This strange symbol is the kidnapper's only signature. Soon, contact is made. The go-between, Dr. John Francis Condon, an elderly educator whose volunteered services are accepted by both Lindbergh and the kidnappers. A tense month later, a meeting with the kidnappers is finally arranged. Here, this Bronx cemetery. The ransom money is handed over, but there is only another note in return. It promises that the child is safe on a boat named Nellie, anchored near Martha's Vineyard. A 3-day search turns up nothing. Then, the cruel truth. Thursday, May 12th, 1932. A tiny, decomposed body is found only a short distance from the Lindbergh home. The Lindbergh kidnapping has become a brutal murder mystery and a national tragedy. The greatest manhunt in American history goes on. For almost 3 years, police scour the country. Gradually, the pieces of the puzzle come together. In the end, the interlocking evidence seems to lead to an unemployed carpenter. This man, Bruno Richard Hauptmann. Wednesday, September 19th, 1934. Hauptmann is arrested and booked at New York's Greenwich Street Station. It doesn't take long before police put together what appears to be an airtight case. A Bronx gas station attendant remembered a man who passed a marked ransom bill and wrote down his license number. It was to this 1931 Dodge. Owner, Bruno Richard Hauptmann. At Bronx home, police push aside his wife Anna and their young son and ransack the place. After ripping apart a small garage, they hit pay dirt, $15,000 in marked ransom money. Later, experts examine samples of Hauptmann's handwriting and conclude that they match the ransom notes. Other clues turn up. The telephone number of Dr. Condon, the go-between, is scrawled on a closet door frame. And then the most dramatic, if not most damaging discovery. A piece of wood missing from Hauptmann's attic. It seems to match perfectly the grain of part of the kidnap ladder. January 2nd, 1935. The trial of Bruno Hauptmann begins. The press crowds around the Hunterdon County Courthouse in Flemington, New Jersey. Nearby, spectators can buy souvenirs, miniature kidnap ladders. Inside the courthouse, the evidence against Hauptmann is brought before the jury. Lindbergh arrives to testify that the voice of the man he heard at the Bronx cemetery belongs to Hauptmann. Dr. Condon identifies Hauptmann as the man who took the ransom money. There is even a witness to place Hauptmann at the scene of the crime. Amanda Hockmuth describes seeing a car roar past him carrying a ladder near the Lindbergh estate. He positively identifies the driver, Bruno Richard Hauptmann. As the jury considers its final verdict, angry crowds form outside the courthouse. The Lindbergh kidnapping is an outrage, and there are those who want revenge. They get it. Friday, April 3rd, 1936, Bruno Hauptmann goes to the electric chair. He is declared dead at 8:47 p.m. He pleads innocent to the end. Not everyone was eager to throw the switch in 1936, but it wasn't until 1976 that investigative journalist Anthony Scaduto took the first truly comprehensive look at the pieces of the puzzle that convicted Bruno Richard Hauptmann. In the process, he uncovered 7 facts that were ignored or never presented at the trial. Fact number 1 concerns the ransom money. Hauptmann claimed he was given a shoebox by this man, Isidore Fish, a friend and business associate. Fish asked Hauptmann to keep the box while he took a trip to Germany. At the trial, Hauptmann insisted that he discovered that the shoebox contained cash only after he learned of Fish's unexpected death in a German hospital. Since Fish owed him money, he felt he could rightfully draw on the shoebox dollars. The press quickly dubbed this the Fish story, and it was never taken seriously at the trial. But the fact remains, there is no evidence of any money spent by Hauptmann before Fish's death. Fact number 2 concerns Isidore Fish. He was a mysterious man with possible underworld connections. Organized crime was suspected from the beginning, and even gangster Al Capone offered Lindbergh his help. After the kidnapping, a desperate Lindbergh secretly arranged for the first ransom note to be passed around to underworld figures in an attempt to get their help. Did this give professional con men a chance to use the secret identifying symbol and forge future ransom notes? Fact number 3 relates to the ransom notes. After his arrest, Hauptmann willingly made dozens of samples of his writing, some duplicating parts of the ransom notes. Despite pages of expert prosecution testimony, one perplexing fact remains clear. The way Hauptmann wrote numbers does not match the style of the ransom note writing. Fact number 4 focuses on the witnesses. Strangely, Dr. Condon refused to identify Hauptmann immediately after his arrest. But when the trial approached, he changed his mind. Why? As for Lindbergh, he never saw the man who took the ransom money at the cemetery, but he claimed to have heard the kidnapper's voice. At the trial, he positively identified that voice as Hauptmann's. On the basis of what? A 2-year-old memory and a sample of just 2 words. Hey, doctor. In earlier statements, Lindbergh remembered hearing Italian voices and seeing apparent lookouts near the cemetery. But these memories seemed forgotten for the trial. Fact number 5 is almost unbelievable. Amandus Hochmuth, the man who claimed to have seen a car driven by Hauptmann near the Lindbergh estate, had cataracts. The jury was never told that this key witness was nearly legally blind. Fact number 6 is a shocker. Dr. Condon's telephone number on Hauptmann's doorframe was a forgery, put there by an unscrupulous reporter out for an easy scoop. Fact number 7 focuses on the famous ladder. Scaduto's book presents evidence against the so-called perfect match of wood grain and questions why a professional carpenter would take a piece of wood from his attic rather than from more conventional sources. He suggests that the attic evidence might have been a police plant. In any case, the crudely built ladder seems hardly the work of a man who made his living working with wood. What do these 7 facts prove? Was Bruno Hauptmann innocent as charged? Was he the sole kidnapper? Did he simply extort the ransom money after the fact? Or was he just a dupe of an underworld gang and Isidore Fish, perhaps with the cooperation of Lindbergh's servants? Curiously, this woman, Violet Sharp, a Lindbergh maid, committed suicide after being interrogated by police. Did she know something? Are important pieces of the puzzle still missing? For many, doubts remain. But at 8:47 p.m. on April 3rd, 1936, for Bruno Richard Hauptmann, the case was closed forever. The Lindbergh kidnapping case shows that even with a trial and final verdict, some mysteries can remain resolutely unsolved. Our next case is a classic example of this. It begins in the perfect place for a legend that has haunted the American imagination for more than 3 generations. The place, Oakdale Cemetery, Fall River, Massachusetts, June 1927. The dead of night. A strange ceremony takes place. A secret burial ordered by the deceased. The controversial life of Lizzie Borden has come to a mysterious end, the way she wanted it. Buried nearby, Father Andrew and stepmother Abby, the victims of one of America's most infamous unsolved mysteries, the Lizzie Borden axe murders. In 1892, Fall River, Massachusetts was a booming textile town, population more than 50,000. If you were wealthy in Fall River, you lived up on the hill, unless you were the family of businessman Andrew J. Borden. 92 2nd Street, not a very respectable address for a man known to be worth a fortune. But Andrew Borden keeps a tight fist on his money. A notorious slumlord. His own house has no gas light, no bathroom, no library, and few visitors. The morning of August 4th, 1892, Andrew Borden and his second wife, Abby, are joined at breakfast by a rare visitor, the brother of Andrew's first wife. He can't help but sense that something is wrong in the Borden household. Bridget Sullivan, the family maid, serves a meal of leftover mutton broth, bananas, cookies, and Johnny cakes. The meal is eaten in stiff silence. The tension began to build after Andrew's attempt to transfer some real estate into his second wife's name. The two Borden daughters resented their stepmother's sudden windfall. On August 4th, eldest daughter Emma is visiting friends in nearby Fairhaven. At 42, Emma Borden has already settled into the life of a 19th century New England spinster. Her younger sister Lizzie, 33, is not so simple. Honest and kind, she is also arrogant and socially ambitious. As devoted to her father as he is to her, she is open in her dislike for her stepmother. Time passes. The breakfast has hardly been touched. Bridget Sullivan remembers why.
For days, all of us had been dreadful sick. Oh, no one knew why. Strange, though. For some reason, Mrs. Borden seemed scared. Talking all the time about someone trying to poison her.
9 a.m. For the moment, all is quiet at 92 2nd Street. The house is empty, except for Lizzie, her stepmother, and Bridget. Inside, Mrs. Borden begins her housework. It's the beginning of an 80-degree day, but she insists that Bridget go outside to wash the windows. Next-door neighbors remember other unusual events that morning.
I was trying to stay cool when I saw this carriage with two strangers inside. It stopped in front of the Bordens. A young fella got out and knocked on the front door. It opened a crack, then just closed real quick.
There was something strange I saw, too. About 9:30, some upstairs shutters suddenly slammed shut. I never saw a carriage, though.
10:45. Bridget Sullivan remembers what happened next.
Mr. Borden came home earlier than usual. He asked for Mrs. Borden, and Miss Lizzie told him her stepmother had received a note and gone out to visit a sick friend. 15 minutes later, exactly 11, I remember listening to the town hall clock strike. I was resting in the upstairs room when I heard Miss Lizzie. "Bridget, come quick. Something's happened to Father."
Downstairs, Bridget finds Lizzie staring into the sitting room. A rarely seen fading photograph captures forever exactly what they saw. Andrew J. Borden had been murdered in his sleep. The killer had hacked in his head with an axe, striking at least 10 times. His face was almost cut in two. A neighbor recalls the horror of what happened next.
When I got there, Lizzie seemed surprisingly calm. Then I noticed her heavy blue dress. There wasn't a drop of blood on it.
Lizzie says her stepmother isn't home, but that's not what they find in the upstairs guest room.
Mrs. Borden was face down in a horrible pool of blood. They said someone had hit her with an axe 19 times.
A maniacal murderer had struck in Fall River, but who? The death announcement was hardly printed before the terrified speculation begins.
Had to be the work of a madman, if you ask me. Old man Borden had enemies. I mean, he was so tight, he collected his rents in person.
To the elite Protestants of Fall River, Bridget Sullivan, the family maid, is a major suspect.
Wasn't she right there when the murders happened? Can't trust those Catholics, if you ask me.
I was looking out the window the day after the murders, and I saw her leave once with a big bundle. Wouldn't mind knowing what was in it.
There was only one other possible suspect.
Lizzie? Impossible. I've seen her in church every Sunday since she was a little girl.
Who killed Mr. and Mrs. Borden? Police figure robbery as a logical motive, but the evidence is puzzling. Mr. Borden was the most likely victim, but medical tests show his wife was killed first, at least an hour and a half earlier, and nothing in the house had been taken. Also, the family seemed to like locked doors. How did a stranger get in? And where did he hide in between the murders? Assistant City Marshal John Fleet helped hunt for clues.
I was searching the cellar when I found an axe head covered with fresh coal ash, like someone was trying to hide it. Even more suspicious, its handle had been freshly broken.
There wasn't much more to go on. There was no sign of blood on the blade, and in 1892, fingerprinting was illegal in Massachusetts. Bridget, the maid, said she was upstairs during the murders. Where was Andrew Borden's youngest daughter, Lizzie?
At the time they say my stepmother was murdered, I was downstairs doing housework. Later, when Father came home, I was sitting in the kitchen, reading a Harper's magazine and eating a pear. I was waiting for a flat iron to get hot. When Father went into the sitting room to take a nap, I went outside and crossed the yard to the barn. I was looking for sinkers to use next time I went fishing. I stayed about 20 minutes, and when I came back, I found my father dead. What kind of person would do such a thing?
A Massachusetts grand jury had an idea.
Elizabeth Andrew Borden, you are hereby accused of first-degree murder.
Taunton Prison. While she awaits trial, hundreds of well-wishers fill Lizzie's room with flowers and letters of support. Lizzie Borden's innocence has become a cause. But Lizzie's supporters don't know the whole truth. Now it can be told in full. Eli Bentz, a well-known Fall River pharmacist, had a strange story to tell.
The day before the murders, Miss Lizzie Borden came into my shop. She said she wanted to buy some prussic acid to clean a sealskin coat. Well, I refused to sell. You see, prussic acid won't clean sealskin. It's a pretty deadly poison, though.
Lizzie's lawyers try to undermine the pharmacist's testimony.
First, Your Honors, the purchase was never made. And second, it should be remembered that Mr. and Mrs. Borden were axed to death, not poisoned.
Bentz's story is ruled irrelevant to the case. The jury never hears it. But there is another equally mysterious incident they do hear about. For days, a friend of the two Borden sisters had been unable to sleep.
It was something I'd like to forget, but I couldn't. 3 days after the murders, I entered the Borden kitchen and found Emma washing dishes. Lizzie was standing by the stove. She was burning a dress. Lizzie told me it was stained with paint. I knew the house had been recently painted, and Lizzie didn't seem to think much of it. But I just couldn't forget all those policemen who were searching for clothing stained with blood.
The friend told another strange story about Lizzie.
The night before the murders, Lizzie visited me unexpectedly. She was upset.
I'm frightened. I'm sure someone wants to kill my father.
The trial of Lizzie Borden begins June 5th, 1893. The all-male jury listens as the defense downplays any conflicts in the Borden household. What about the carriage and the mysterious stranger? Did he have something to do with the murders? Did he carry a note to Mrs. Borden? Neither the note or the young man ever showed up, if they ever existed. Then there is the matter of Lizzie's spotless dress. Could she have changed clothes? Did she convince Bridget the maid to carry the dress out with her in the unsearched bundle? The heavy dress she submitted to police 5 days after the crime was a strange choice for such a hot day. Did Lizzie hide the dress and burn it later? Her sister Emma, who was also in the kitchen, staunchly defends Lizzie's innocence. The axe seems a strong piece of evidence for the prosecution.
Gentlemen of the jury, note the skulls of Mr. and Mrs. Borden. The axe blade found by police matches perfectly these horrible wounds.
Speaking for the defense, I remind you that there were no traces of blood on this blade. And if you look carefully, you'll see that it's a common brand found in thousands of homes, not just Lizzie Borden's.
For many, it's one thing to hear the evidence against Andrew Borden's youngest daughter, but believing that this church-going spinster is an axe-wielding fiend is not so easy. Finally, the jury returns its verdict.
Not guilty, Your Honors.
Lizzie Borden is a free woman. Who killed Andrew and Abby Borden on that stifling August morning? For the rest of her life, Lizzie lived under suspicion. When she moved into an elegant mansion with her inherited wealth, refusing to live in bereaved retirement, she alienated her sister and most of Fall River society. Children sang about her as they played. People whispered, and newspapers kept the guessing game alive. Busy with charities and good works, Lizzie Borden rarely mentioned her father and stepmother's infamous end. If she held a secret, she took it to her grave. The 1920s was the era of rough and ready journalism. Few stories made bigger headlines than the sensational case that's next in our file.
Extra, extra, sex, sin, forbidden passion, a double murder, high society scandal, extra, extra, read all about it, what the pig woman saw.
New Brunswick, New Jersey, September 15th, 1922, DeRussey's Lane, a favorite place for late-night hanky-panky. On the night of September 15th, there is more than hanky-panky going on in DeRussey's Lane. Saturday, September 16th, 15-year-old Pearl Bomber and 23-year-old Raymond Schneider have come to spend some time alone. Two more lovers are already here, but they're no threat to Pearl and Ray's privacy. They've been dead for more than 12 hours.
I thought they was, asleep, laying next to each other, under that crabapple tree. But I saw the blood. He'd been shot one time, right square in the head. The lady was worse. I saw she'd been shot a lot more than once. That's when I spotted the scarf around her neck. It was just crawling with maggots. Her throat was cut wide open.
A calling card propped up against the dead man's shoe introduces him. Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall, rector of fashionable St. John's Church. Reverend Hall's dead companion is Mrs. Eleanor Mills, wife of the St. John's handyman and soprano in the church choir. Pieces of passionate love letters are strewn between the bodies. 10:30 a.m. Somerset County Police are on the scene, about to begin one of the most bungled murder investigations in the annals of American crime. Reporters and curious onlookers are only minutes behind, trampling across possible footprints and ransacking a nearby farm, suspected as a love nest. The Hall Mills romance was hardly a secret around ivy-covered St. John's Church. The Reverend Hall was outgoing and well-liked, particularly among the female members of his congregation. Mrs. Hall, 10 years older than her late husband and a prominent figure in New Brunswick society, seemed to find nothing unusual in her husband's special concern for the soul of Mrs. Mills. The two women appeared friendly. The contrast between them was not as great as this retouched 1920s newspaper photo. Mrs. Hall even helped pay for Mrs. Mills' medical bills after an expensive operation. Mrs. Mills needed all the financial help she could get. Her husband, James, has never made more than $35 a week. Mr. and Mrs. Mills lived in this modest home 5 blocks from the Reverend and Mrs. Hall's elegant mansion. James Mills' 16-year-old daughter, Charlotte, seems to know a lot about her mother's devotion to Reverend Hall, but Mr. Mills plays dumb. Cynical reporters note it isn't too hard for him. Still, they find his blissful ignorance difficult to believe. From the beginning, the investigation is a shambles. Banner headlines bring thousands of tourists and amateur detectives. Now nationally famous, the crabapple tree is picked clean by souvenir seekers. The Love Nest farm is converted into a makeshift murder museum, and popcorn and hot dogs are hawked at the murder site. Rumors are rampant as reporters take turns posing for each other to illustrate how the bodies were found. Initial suspects range from a gang of thieves to a vigilante murder by the powerful New Jersey Ku Klux Klan. After months of confusion and delay, local police have collected all the evidence, including Mrs. Hall's blood-stained dress, but they have yet to make an arrest. Finally, the state steps in. The people of New Brunswick are stunned when state prosecutors announce their suspects.
We are turning 2 names over for grand jury consideration. The Reverend Hall's wife, Mrs. Edward Wheeler Hall, and her cousin, stockbroker Henry Carpenter.
Somerville, New Jersey, November 20th, 1922. The Somerset County Grand Jury convenes. A special prosecutor hints at explosive testimony.
We have found an eyewitness, a woman who actually watched the murders committed.
The woman's name? Well, she says it's Jane Gibson. But reporters come up with something that will sell more newspapers.
You say she's a local hog farmer? Great. From now on, she's the pig woman.
November 28th, on the stand, the pig woman tells an incredible story.
I was out riding my mule on DeRussey's Lane when I saw it all. 2 men and 2 women fighting. There was a bunch of gunshots, and I heard a woman scream a name. Henry, it was. About 1 in the morning, I went back, and I saw this lady crying. The lady was the Reverend's wife, Mrs. Hall.
The pig woman's story makes enormous headlines, but her credibility isn't very big in New Brunswick. Mrs. Hall, on the other hand, has the highest credentials.
I categorically deny any knowledge of my husband's murder.
The grand jury believes her and refuses to act on the case. For 4 years, the Hall Mills murder remains in the unsolved file, but the mystery of the minister and the choir singer is not so easily forgotten.
Dateline, New Brunswick, New Jersey, July 28, 1926. On the basis of new evidence, arrest warrants have been issued once again for Mrs. Edward Wheeler Hall and her cousin, Henry Carpenter. This time, Mrs. Hall's brothers, Henry and Willie Stevens, are also accused.
The Hall Mills murder is back on the front page, bigger than ever. The old cast of characters is back. James Mills. One reporter called him a harmless, dull little fellow.
Oh, sure he is. What about those sharp knives in his old toolkit?
James Mills' daughter Charlotte is now 20.
I'm a flapper, and I don't care what anybody thinks.
An enterprising newspaper, the New York American, sees attributes in addition to a well-turned ankle and hires her as a trial reporter. Mrs. Hall's brother, Willie Stevens, has always been a little eccentric. But more to the point, he owns a .32 caliber pistol, just the kind that killed Reverend Hall and Mrs. Mills. Henry Stevens and Henry Carpenter are as respectable as they come, but they also happen to share the first name the pig woman said she heard the night of the murders. Mrs. Hall remains her proper, poised self.
Mrs. Hall, would you comment on rumors that you know a lot more about your husband's affair with Mrs. Mills than you've let on so far?
I have no comment, gentlemen.
Best of all for the press, the pig woman and her mule are back. Like fine cheese, her story has improved with age. Millions of newspaper readers stand ready to eat up every sentence.
Dateline, Somerville, New Jersey, November 9th, 1926. Somerville has become a communications command post as everyone waits for the promised new evidence.
Charlotte Mills testifies early in the trial.
Sure, I knew about it. Once my mother told my father straight out. I care more for the Reverend Hall's little finger, she said, than I do for your whole body. Oh, there's something else I should tell you. The night she died, I saw my mother cut an article out of the newspaper. It said divorce for ministers was okay.
James Mills finally admits that he had an inkling of his wife's love life.
I asked where she was going the night she got killed, but all she said was, follow me if you want to find out.
Mrs. Hall also talked about the night of the murders.
The telephone rang, and I answered. It was Mrs. Mills calling for my husband. As soon as he picked up the receiver in another room, I hung up.
We know that Mrs. Mills had called to arrange a meeting in DeRussey's Lane. Are you sure you didn't hear more of that conversation, Mrs. Hall?
Absolutely not. He told me he was going to the church. That's where I looked for him when he didn't come home.
Didn't you call police that night asking about any reported casualties? A rather unusual word to use, wouldn't you agree?
I meant accidents. Ask Mr. Mills. He was searching that night, too. When I saw him the next day, he guessed that his wife and my husband had eloped.
Yeah, I said that, but the Reverend's wife had her own notion. She told me she thought they were dead.
The prosecution starts to build its case with a blockbuster.
We have discovered a fingerprint on the calling card found leaning against Reverend Hall's shoe. Our experts have identified that print. It belongs to Mrs. Hall's brother, Willie Stevens.
And what about the .32 caliber pistol? Well, on the stand, Willie brings evidence that his pistol wasn't working at the time of the murders, and the defense questions the fingerprint.
Gentlemen of the jury, don't you find it a little suspicious that this alleged fingerprint was only discovered after 4 years? Who knows how many unscrupulous individuals have had a chance to handle this evidence?
The prosecution comes back with a shocker.
We have ordered Mrs. Mills' body to be exhumed, and her new autopsy has confirmed a grisly rumor. The victim's tongue and larynx were cut out by her killer. The organs she used to sing in the St. John's Choir were removed.
As the trial proceeds, Mrs. Hall and her relatives present their carefully prepared alibis. But everyone is waiting for the return of the pig woman. Thursday, November 18th, it couldn't have been more dramatic. Rushed from a hospital where she's been seriously ill, the pig woman arrives at the courthouse in an ambulance. Laying on a stretcher with nurses hovering nearby, the pig woman reveals a greatly embellished version of her 1922 story.
They was arguing real loud. Then came the shots. That's when I saw one man's face clear. It was him, all right. It was Willie Stevens.
The jury is stunned by the pig woman's accusation, but then the trial makes an abrupt turnabout. Mrs. Hall's lawyer counters the prosecution's star witness with a pig woman of his own. A DeRussy Lane neighbor, Mrs. Russell, testifies that she was talking with the prosecution's supposed eyewitness at the exact time she claimed to be watching the murders. To add insult to injury, the pig woman's mother is brought in.
My daughter ain't nothing but a liar. Always has been.
Dateline, Somerville, November 19th, 1926. The Hall Mills jury is ready to announce its verdict. Not guilty.
So who killed the minister and the choir singer? Was James Mills as harmless as he appeared? Despite the verdict, was it the Reverend's wife, Mrs. Hall, and her relatives, either alone or with hired assassins? Then there's the intriguing theory that was brushed aside at the time. The ritual quality of the murders, the carefully placed calling card, and the mutilation of Mrs. Mills could well suggest the Ku Klux Klan, out to teach two well-known sinners a lesson. Over the years, arguments for and against all these theories have been put forth. But to this day, almost 60 years later, the murder of the minister and the choir singer remains unsolved. The Hall Mills murder is a classic American whodunit. But there's an English mystery that remains unmatched in our unsolved file. A letter received October 16th, 1888, smeared with human blood. It was posted from hell and signed simply, yours truly, Jack the Ripper. They began Friday, August 31st, 1888. A string of murders that terrified the England of Queen Victoria. The victims, all prostitutes living in the squalid Whitechapel district of London, each probably strangled first, then horribly attacked. Internal organs were ripped out and twisted around the bodies, and then the victim's uterus was surgically removed with a razor-sharp knife. The attack suggests someone with medical knowledge, with the ability to move easily at night through twisted, fog-filled streets. The killer takes perverse pride in his grisly skill. He taunts police with a series of letters. Then, after 3 months of terror, silence. On November 8th, 1888, as suddenly as they had begun, the letters and the slaughter vanish in a fog of mystery. Recently, with the cooperation of London Scotland Yard, we put together a lineup of prime suspects, a gallery of faces in the fog. Is one of them yours truly, Jack the Ripper? Meet suspect number 1, Dr. Neil Cream, arsonist, abortionist, blackmailer, and murderer. In 1892, he was convicted of poisoning 4 prostitutes and sentenced to hang. A persistent but unconfirmed rumor claims that his last words on the scaffold were the unfinished sentence, I am Jack the... Suspect number 2, best known as George Chapman. His real name is probably Severin Antoniovich Klosowski, a barber surgeon who lived in Whitechapel. Chapman was more than familiar with sharp knives, and his penchant for poisoning wives and lovers led him to the hangman on April 7th, 1903. Had George Chapman added a few secret slashings to his long list of crimes? Suspect number 3, this man, His Royal Highness, Prince Albert Victor Eddie, Duke of Clarence. As eldest son of future King Edward VII, Eddie was in line for the English throne. In 1970, it was announced that secret papers of Queen Victoria's physician clearly hinted that Eddie was the Ripper and that the royal family knew all about it.
It was claimed that Eddie was hidden away in an insane asylum where he died, driven mad by syphilis in 1892. The murders were alleged to be an act of revenge against a prostitute who gave him the disease that drove him mad. Was Jack the Ripper a future English king? Eddie's tutor and possible homosexual lover, James Kenneth Stephen, is suspect number 4. It has been suggested that he killed the Whitechapel prostitutes as blood sacrifices to Eddie after the Duke ended their affair. There are similarities between Stephen's handwriting and the Ripper letters. Last but far from least, meet suspect number 5, Montague John Druitt. Druitt drowned himself Monday, December 3rd, 1888, less than a month after the last Ripper victim was slashed almost beyond recognition. Chief Ripper Detective Sir Melville McNaughton was sure this was his man, but he refused to reveal the basis of his suspicions. Those are the suspects. There may not be enough evidence for a conviction, but is one of them yours truly, Jack the Ripper? What do you think? Listen to this eerie eyewitness account from a Whitechapel constable.
On the night of Sunday, September 30th, 1888, I was on the job in Whitechapel when I was surprised by this strange-looking man. He was about 33, 5 foot 10 inches tall. He looked rather shabby, but I could tell his clothes were far from cheap. His face was long and thin, his nostrils delicate, and his hair jet black. His complexion was rather washed out, but his eyes almost glowed in the dark. I'll never forget his voice. It was surprisingly soft, almost musical. Good evening, Constable.
Seconds later, a few feet away, the bloody corpse of another Ripper victim was revealed by the constable's flickering lamplight. The dark man with the soft voice had vanished into the fog-bound night. The legend of yours truly, Jack the Ripper, lives on. San Francisco, 1979. A city separated by almost a century from the London of Jack the Ripper. If he weren't undoubtedly dead, Jack might feel at home in these foggy Victorian neighborhoods. Someone like him did find a home here, and he may still walk these San Francisco streets. He called himself Zodiac. Riverside, California. On the night of October 30th, 1966, a good-looking young woman left this college library and started home. She never made it. Her brutally stabbed body was found the next day by a campus groundskeeper. Sometime afterward, a young man sat quietly in this same library. No one noticed as he carefully scratched something into a study desktop. A poem, its subject, violent death. Its final line, just wait until next time. Next time came on December 20th, 1968. A teenage couple stop in a secluded lover's lane in the Northern California community of Vallejo. Both end up victims of a killer with a 9mm handgun. On July 5th, 1969, another couple is attacked in Vallejo's Blue Rock Spring Park. This time, the young man survives, but the identity of the killer remains a mystery. That changes on August 2nd. A strange letter arrives at the offices of 3 Northern California newspapers. The writer takes credit for the recent murders and threatens more. As a clue to his identity, he encloses a page covered with these eerie symbols, a cryptogram, his signature, this sinister crosshair sign. Top code breakers and even a Navy computer struggle to decipher the message, but a Salinas, California school teacher is the one who finally cracks the code. Written without a break between words, the message is terrifying.
I like killing people because it's so much fun. When I die, I'll be reborn in paradise, and all that I've killed will become my slaves.
On September 27th, the code killer strikes again, this time with a 12-inch knife. The victims are a third couple. Miraculously, the young man survives. He relives the horror of his experience for police and the media, but he can offer little to identify his attacker. The killer wore a hood when he struck.
My heart against him. I just don't want this to happen again to anyone else.
It does happen again. October 12th, 1969, near this San Francisco street corner about 9:30 p.m. The victim, a part-time cab driver. This time there are witnesses. They see a young white male about 170 pounds with a blonde crew cut and glasses run into a nearby playground. October 13th, the police finally have the beginnings of a face to work with. But the killer is far from frightened. In another letter, he tells the world his name.
This is Zodiac speaking. I am the murderer of the taxi driver over on Washington Street in Maple last night.
A blood-stained scrap of the murdered cab driver's shirt sent with the letter clinches the identification. 2 days later, there is near panic in San Francisco. Zodiac threatens to attack a bus of school children.
School children make nice targets. I'll just pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing off the bus.
Police set up special protective measures, even though they know they're up against heavy odds. But Zodiac is only toying with them. He never acts on his threat. Headquarters, San Francisco Police Department. A key figure in the Zodiac investigation is Detective Dave Toschi. Toschi isn't shy about publicity, but he's also a seasoned cop who's determined to get his man. Toschi seems tantalizingly close on October 22nd. Someone claiming to be Zodiac calls a San Francisco talk show and arranges a meeting with lawyer Melvin Belli.
I got no way of telling whether this is the man who calls himself Zodiac, but I know it's a man who needs help very badly.
Belli keeps the appointment, but the caller never shows. Then, on December 28th, Belli receives a scrap of the cab driver's shirt and a frightening Christmas greeting.
This is Zodiac speaking. I wish you a happy Christmas. The one thing I ask of you is this. Please help me. I cannot reach out for help because of this thing in me won't let me.
For Dave Toschi and the San Francisco Police, 1970 is a year of frustration. The letters and the cards continue. Zodiac brags that he has killed 9, then 10, 12, 13. The police have little new to go on, except this more detailed composite picture. During 1971, Zodiac ups his count to 17. Some unsolved murders have possible Zodiac links. But in this fascinating case, even an accurate death count is impossible. 1973. For almost 2 years, Zodiac has been ominously silent. Then, January 31st, the silence is shattered.
I saw him think The Exorcist was the biggest satirical comedy I've ever seen.
The unsigned note ends with a mysterious quotation from a Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, hinting at suicide and a final threat.
If I don't see this note in your paper, I'll do something nasty.
For the next 4 years, San Franciscans anxiously await Zodiac's next move. Occasional anonymous letters are linked to the mysterious killer. But by 1978, police wonder if the man called Zodiac has finally decided to join his victims in his fantasy afterlife. Then, April 25th, 1978.
This is the Zodiac speaking. I am back with you. Tell Herb Cain that I'm here. I was always here. That city pig Toschi is good, but I'm smarter and better.
Once again, Dave Toschi and the killer he's tracked for 9 frustrating years are headline news. But then, the case takes an unexpected turn. A magazine writer reveals that he received anonymous letters praising Toschi's work. The letters were all traced to Toschi himself. Then when experts doubt the authenticity of the latest Zodiac message, rumors spread that it too is an example of Dave Toschi's anonymous letter writing. A desperate attempt to keep his most famous case alive. Was it? Toschi openly admits writing the letters about his work, but denies he wrote the latest Zodiac note, and there's no proof that he did. The Toschi scandal, the latest and most amazing addition to a frustrating string of false leads. To this day, the Zodiac mystery remains in the unsolved file of the San Francisco Police. Where is Zodiac? Dead, in prison for some lesser offense, or safe in a mental institution? Has he lost his lust to kill and returned to a life of nonviolent obscurity? Or is he walking these streets, biding his time, waiting to strike again? In this program, you've seen only a sample of some of the cases in this file of unsolved mysteries. And the search for solutions goes on. Did Lizzie Borden get away with murder? Was Bruno Hauptmann executed unjustly? Who killed the minister and the choir singer? And who was yours truly, Jack the Ripper? You've heard the testimony, seen the evidence. Whodunit?
Not all dinosaurs were massive. For a tiny few, life close to the ground was practical and even beneficial. A whopping small dinosaur, next on Discovery Sunday.